My name's Gemma. I am a PhD student at the University of Sydney, and I'll be chairing this session. But before we get into today, I want to acknowledge the Darawal, Yuin and Wadiwadi peoples as the traditional custodians of the country in the Illawarra, which is where the University of Wollongong is situated. And I also want to recognise the Darugungundagara peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today, in the so-called Blue Mountains. I want to recognise their elders past and present, and also to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today we have three different talks that are on slightly different things, but the broad theme is diversity and knowing. So we're going to be talking about culture, biology, taking cultural perspectives as well as philosophical ones. We're starting with Vincent Bicego, who is from the University of Wollongong, and will be speaking to us about objectives, embedding Indigenous perspectives into art and design curriculum. So go ahead.
Okay, can I, first of all, can I get a 10-minute, we talk for 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, talk for 20 minutes. So do you want me to give you a ding when it's 10 minutes in?
Give me a 10-minute ding, that would be great.
No problem.
Because I'm notorious for trying to cram way too much into my talks. Okay.
No worries.
So, share screen, conference paper. Okay, so is everyone seeing my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So yes, the title of my paper is Objectives, Embedding Indigenous Perspectives into the Art and Design Curriculum. And like Gemma, I would like to acknowledge the Darawal people. I live and work on Darawal country, and I want to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So this paper considers how Indigenous perspectives were embedded into a first-year undergraduate art and design subject called 100 Objects That Changed the World. It was first offered in autumn session of 2020 in the School of Arts, English and Media at the University of Wollongong, and we taught it again in early 2021. I was brought in at the 11th hour to basically put this subject together. There was an outline that existed and there were students already enrolling into it, but there was essentially no content. So there was a huge amount of groundwork to do over a very short period of time. I had just finished 18 months as a research assistant for the business faculty, actually, at UOW, and on their participation in a project called Jindola. Now that was established by lecturer in Indigenous Knowledges, Jade Kennedy, and its goal is, of course, to embed Indigenous perspectives throughout the university curriculum. So we looked at different theories like cultural capital, cultural interface, Indigenous standpoint theory, and critical race theory. So I was really keen to really put Indigenous perspectives into this subject that I was asked to put together. And the teaching team were all in unison. We wanted Indigenous cultures and histories to be included in it. What really came out of Jindola was the idea that actually embeddedness can be a bit of a misnomer. You need to really allow Indigenous or non-Western perspective to shape a subject from the ground up. So the way we tackled 100 Objects That Changed the World was by really scrutinizing from the beginning the Eurocentric meta-narratives that have traditionally excluded non-Western worldviews and practices from the sciences and humanities. And we made no secret whatsoever with the students that this was our goal. We were very upfront. We said, look, a title called 100 Objects That Changed the World, different people will come up with very different lists of objects, okay? It'll be based on socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, and ideology. And, you know, we, as someone who comes from post-colonial theory and critical theory, we made no secret about those perspectives. So we really, in the words of Gayatri Spivak, I should say, we really needed to welcome all the information retrieval in silenced areas that are taking place in anthropology, political science, history, and sociology. And I think we were really justified in doing this. Not only was the subject, like every other subject across the world in early 2020, destabilized by COVID, not only had we had to put this subject together really quickly, we then had to, within the first 3 or 4 weeks, suddenly change it into a totally online course because of COVID. During the semester, of course, we had the Black Lives movement really come to the fore in all the news reports, and we saw these toppling of colonial monuments and the different arguments that people were engaging in around this supposed destruction of heritage. So I think we were very justified in taking the approach we did, because of course, while these icons of heritage were supposedly being destroyed, the other side of the coin was that we had thousands and thousands of year-old Aboriginal heritage, of course, being destroyed as normal, as usual. So it really was continues to be an unlevel playing field. So once again, it wasn't so much to embed in a tokenistic way, but to really reshape. We settled on a couple of methodologies. The first one was historical materialism, which of course is a branch of Marxism that takes its position that the development of history is not determined by the desires or actions of specific human subjects, but is instead shaped by the objective facts of material existence. So we really tried to emphasize to the students that many discoveries and inventions are thus contingent on a person's or a society's material existence, the environment in which they lived. So we talked about we also talked about human ecologies. And rather than trying to see different human ecologies on a linear scale where we move from primitive to evolved or civilized, we tried to have a non-chronological approach to that. And if you think about the different human ecologies that people experience in their lives, we see an overlapping of many different lifestyles even at the beginning of the 21st century. So while it was important to tackle the differences between some of the major forms of existence that human beings have practiced, we also really tried to emphasize that it's largely dependent upon the environments in which people live, not simply because one culture is, this old-fashioned idea of primitive or not evolved, So historical materialism was important for that. But of course, historical materialism has been criticized even from its inception, largely because it sees class as the sole antagonism between human beings, and that it's only when class is eradicated that human beings will experience liberation. So revised historical materialism really puts to the front the idea that there are obviously many other areas of inequality in regards to sexuality, gender, race, and of course the environment in which you live and how the environment is largely being exploited. So it wasn't just historical materialism, we very much went with revised historical materialism. And of course, we needed to emphasize that inventions or discoveries don't exist in a vacuum. We tried to really debunk the idea of genius. So of course, when you think about, there are plenty of examples you can pick from history, but the one that often stands out in my mind is, of course, Edward Jenner became acclaimed for promoting vaccinations. But we know that, 50 years earlier, it was Mary Montagu who first brought the idea of vaccination to public attention in the early 1700s, and that she, of course, had been exposed to that idea from her time in the Orient. And of course, when you talk about people like David Unipon, who came up with the idea of the helicopter 20 years before it was actually realized by the military, he wasn't able to patent the idea simply because, like many Aboriginal people at the time, he lived in impoverishment and couldn't afford the patents. So we really used historical materialism as a way to debunk ideas of social Darwinism, the idea of meritocracy and genius. We also really emphasized, obviously, that there are certain objects that we use in our human that make up our human ecology that we're now rethinking. Things like the plow, which was one of the first objects we looked at, so vital to the emergement, the creation of an agricultural, agrarian human ecology. But the extent to which agriculture is now responsible for the destruction of so many forests throughout the world, and obviously has a big impact on CO2 emissions. These are things we're now rethinking. So we challenge the kids to think about positive versus negative change. We also emphasized that some of the objects on our list were symbolic rather than literal. Our very first object was the dog collar. Now, of course, the dog collar literally did not change the world. We allowed that object to facilitate a discussion about the domestication of animals, because once again, it's only with the domestication of the dog and later other animals onwards that human beings develop an agricultural society. So I've mentioned human ecology, the study of interacting, ecology is the study of interacting natural systems. Human ecology can be thought of as the interconnection of natural and human-made systems. And we introduced the kids, the students, I should stop calling them kids, the students, to some of the writing of Donna Haraway, who talks about system breakdown on a global scale. So if we think about human ecologies as systems and how they interact with natural systems, they've impacted so much on natural systems that we're seeing systematic breakdown of these natural systems across the world. For this reason, we also challenge the kids to think about animism versus human agency, because there's a problem inherent in the title of this subject, 100 Objects That Change the World. Objects don't change the world, human beings do. It's the way we create and use objects. So we really tried to emphasize to the students that as artists and designers, it is our job to be aware of how these changes came about, what works, what doesn't, try to understand or at least hypothesize why, and take critical steps towards better design outcomes. I'm going to just quickly jump forward. So once we sort of established these methodologies and had come up with our 100 objects, we dispersed them across the 10 weeks and basically introduced 10 new items to the students each week. We didn't want to bombard them straight away with 100 objects. We wanted to introduce them to these objects gradually over the weeks. But we came up with weekly topics that were malleable, okay, that we could play a bit with these words, these themes, so that we could incorporate usual suspects, but also some unusual subjects. So essentially we ended up with Anthropocene, body, infrastructure, imperialism, database, artifact, sound and vision, domesticity, and heavenly bodies. So, I mean, this is an example of, the first slide of the first lecture in which we actually look at some objects after the introductory lecture. So Anthropocene, and the kids are introduced to 10 objects and we then go through them. So understandably, this was an incredibly information heavy subject, especially for a first year subject. And we tried to condense certain objects, a number of objects, into any one given objects. So for example, the telephone and the television, which have obviously shaped and impacted human life on such a huge scale throughout the 20th century, are conspicuous by their absence on the list. So that's because we simply knew that by talking about telegraphy, we were then able to segue into talking about the telephone and television. So there was, on top of an already information-rich subject, there was a lot of condensing going on. One way we felt that we could really aid the students through this was by encouraging to read the work of Miki Ball, who talks about traveling concepts. And really, we did this because we wanted to make sure the kids weren't scared of the huge amount of information we were giving to them. We really wanted them just to understand that we were looking at associations. Okay, this was a really interdisciplinary subject. We just wanted them to understand the idea of building associations, making connections, and not seeing objects in a vacuum, okay? That there were precedents to these objects, and these objects led to other things. So we really emphasized 3 lenses through which to look at each object: history, politics, and concept. And these 3 lenses we went back to over and over again, not just in class, but also in their assessment tasks. So in regards to actual Indigenous objects or subject matter, I'll take you through some of them. So one of our objects was simply stone. Now, this was one of the natural objects that we presented to the students to really get them thinking about where the natural ends and where human intervention ends. At what point does a natural phenomena become a human-made object? So, we began by talking about the really iconic standing stones that Britain is famous for. This, of course, allowed a segue into discussing Indigenous examples of the same thing. So we get the famous Brewarrina fish traps in New South Wales. So this is just an example of how we were able to segue to Indigenous non-Western examples through some of our officially numbered objects. Even with something like the Maltese cross tube, which of course was responsible for some of the first X-ray photography, we were able to then segue into a discussion of the traditions of X-ray art in Indigenous culture. Now, on one hand, of course, there is no historical connection. But once again, this is about building up associations, getting the kids to think about precedents and examples from other cultures, and obviously particularly Australian culture, that, on some level share this vision. Object 71 from the lecture Domesticity, once again, we could have picked an example from any culture really, but this was a great opportunity to talk about the really iconic kelp bags from Tasmanian Indigenous culture, because we wanted to talk about one of the most fundamental things in human society, and that is the ability to store fresh food or fresh water. So this was on one level an arbitrary decision, but it was an opportunity to give a Indigenous example. And this, of course, segued into the history of things like pottery in Asia, and a very modern example, where we get to Tupperware when we get to when we start talking about the industrial age. Boomerang, of course, in many ways, a very obvious, iconic choice. There was sort of no way we weren't going to talk about the boomerang. What I think we did that was interesting was we talked about it in regards to infrastructure. So this was an object we talked about from our infrastructure lecture. And we really emphasized the multi-purpose use of this object. It's on one level, it's a hunting tool. On another, it's a tool, that can be used for cutting and for digging. It's used to create music. it's a musical instrument, and of course it's a ceremonial object as well. So it was really important to traditional infrastructure of everyday life. And of course, when we get to the modern age, we
2 minutes
see
left.
Sorry?
2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. We see a really different adaptation of traditional tools like the boomerang. Okay, I'm probably going to have to end on this. The two really big objects that we really needed to tackle was the wheel and the invention of writing, because in many ways, these are sort of have long been seen as the inventions that separated the primitive from the civilized. And once again, if we go back to the idea of historical materialism, we really needed to emphasize to the kids, these inventions are contingent on the environments in which they emerged. There was no need for the development of vehicles to carry large amounts of grain in Australia. And even if there was no beasts of burden to do so. So once again, we bring it back to the historical materialism, that it's not that Indigenous culture or other cultures that did not invent the wheel, it's not that they were less evolved. It comes down to do with the material nature of their existence. And writing, of course, stems once again from increased agricultural production. With increased agricultural production, ancient societies needed a way of recording and keeping a stock list, essentially, of the things that were being produced. So writing aided short-term memory. You can only fit so much into your short-term memory, and writing was a device that allowed an aid to short-term memory. Therefore, totally unnecessary in Indigenous culture. Like I said, I always try to cram too much into my lectures, into my presentations. I'm sorry, so I'll have to end it there.
Thanks. I'm not sure if you actually heard my original ring. I did.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thanks for that. That was very interesting. Do we have any questions? If you want to stop screen sharing, you can do that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine.
How do I stop sharing? Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, that's all right. Do we have any questions for Vincent?
Yes, I have one. You mentioned the fuzzy border between artifact and natural systems, or human systems and natural systems. To what extent do you think that's due to the kind of categorical absolutism of Greek ideas and concepts? Techne versus ousia and so on.
I can't talk too much about the ancient Greek ideas, but I think, and we talked a little bit about this in the first plenary discussion, that idea of real distinct categories and even ruptures between discipline and stuff. I think it goes straight to the heart of that idea of, we know that from the Enlightenment onwards, there's a birth of all these different disciplines. And so in many ways, ideas sort of become separated and become compartmentalized. And, I don't need to tell you guys that over the last 20 years, there's sort of been a really, what's the word I'm looking for? Conscious decision to try to reintegrate the disciplines on some level. Everyone talks about interdisciplinary work these days for that very reason. So yeah, I think it goes to the heart of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I'm just interested to see what you thought, because my area is to do with classification, and in the sciences, classification, as Tao pointed out, the breaking up of domains into small elemental objects is really difficult, and they constantly keep revising them. And I'm going to mention species in my talk in a minute. So I'm just interested to get a different point of view. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we made a conscious decision. There were certain things that we didn't want to bog down our list with, and even though they were really important, and that was scientific or medical discoveries, because the list is absolutely endless. Also, important documents. I mean, we could have had 100 documents that changed the world. Magna Carta, Doomsday, the Doomsday Book. We could have had any number of those. So really, the object that I was just about to talk about was the Yirrkala Bark petitions. That's really one of the only documents we included on the list, because we felt that it went to the heart of putting a spotlight on that idea that, just because a culture is not a written culture doesn't mean there aren't very sophisticated rules and laws. And in the same with medical or scientific discoveries, really the only ones we sort of had on our list were penicillin and vaccines, because we felt they were really pertinent to what is happening in the world today. And they were really good examples where, once again, we were able to challenge the students to really think, where does the natural end and the human begin? If you catch something through no fault of your own, you develop immunity to it in many cases. That's a totally natural system. Or die, indeed. So that's a natural system that you can't really say humans necessarily interfere with. But exposing yourself quite deliberately to something, knowing that there's a good chance you'll catch immunity. A vaccine's objects, there were examples. But a lot of the scientific discoveries were mediated largely through objects that we could quite distinctly say this is an object. So, glasses, for example, spectacles, we talked about spectacles, and that led to discussions about the invention of the telescope and the microscope, so.
Cool. Thank you.
We probably have time for one more quick question if someone has a question.
Yeah, I've got one. Thank you so much, Vincent. That was great. I mean, that's actually amazing resonances between this presentation and the one I just gave in a lot of ways as a kind of a project.
I apologize I couldn't finish it.
No, we can chat about it another time. I actually wanted to, a couple of things to say, a really quick note on John's point about techne, and it occurs to me now that in the plenary when I was talking about creativity, I mimicked the definition of poesis, so the rupture between techne and poesis that happens in sort of the Greek era might have a lot to do with actually why practice and doing is sort of so separated now. But that's the side point. I really was interested in the kinds of assessment that you were asking students to do on this subject. And if you invited them to also, name their own objects, or how did you go about, what kinds of things
the first assessment was very much asking them to pick an object from one of the first few lectures of the semester and consider those 3 lenses. One of the later assessments was to pick an object that was hard to categorize in regards to, how do you classify this object? And the third assessment was in regards to they could pick a speculative object, an invention or object that people were currently trying to invent, and talk about the historical, conceptual, political nature of that speculative object, or it was I can't remember. I'm sorry. It always was always anchored by those three lenses. But yeah, we went from objects we presented to them to objects they could pick themselves, and they needed to think, how does this object defy classification? And then a speculative object, something that was in the works. And it couldn't be fantastical. It couldn't just be something that they had dreamt about. It needed to be something that scientists or designers were currently working on and trying to achieve, you know. Yeah. Sorry, does that answer your question?
No, it does. No, it's fascinating. Just sort of, yeah, because the assessments could go anywhere, but it's a really, really fun sort of thing. I'd love to do this subject, actually.
The kids, I was really pleased with the feedback from the students. I think by and large, everyone thought it was a really fascinating subject. Some students felt that I think some quite intelligent students really felt we labored certain things. But at the same time, we also get students who really, I don't know if it's a generational thing or maybe it's just because I'm getting older, there are students who also feel they need to be spoon-fed. So, you know, it's hard to get the happy medium in regards to whether you direct or whether you throw ideas out and let them sort of go by themselves. It was a first year undergraduate subject, so we did. I think we were justified in being quite directional in that regard. Yeah.
I just realized we actually have a little bit of extra time in this session because we only have 3 speakers. So Tess, if you want to ask a question, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That was so interesting, Vincent. It seems like University of Wollongong is really progressive in this space. You mentioned Jade Kennedy, and there was a photo of him in his baseball cap. He came down to Monash and gave a workshop on integrating Indigenous perspectives and thinking into the biological sciences.
Yeah.
And I think he's doing really good work in this space. So at some point, I'd like to follow up with you and find out more about the Jindola?
Jindola. Yeah, Jindola is the local word for goanna. And I apologize, I can't remember the reason why Jade chose the goanna as sort of the symbol for the project. There was obviously a reason. No, Jade's great. Jade is really approachable. He's really open to hearing ideas. He's really welcoming to non-Indigenous people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing and rethinking education and how Indigenous perspectives can be embedded, how they can really reshape things. No, he's a really important person in the UAW environment, and as you just said, I mean, beyond as well. So yeah, no, I just wish, and I think it's getting better. I think all universities need someone like Jade, but of course, like a lot of situations where people are increasingly wanting to do the right thing and have Indigenous perspectives. We need more voices because people like Jade can only do so much. So that's why, yeah, it's great that there are people like him, but I know he's done so much to ensure that there is an upcoming generation of Indigenous spokespeople who are really, I know they're just going to really transform our not just our education system in the coming decades, but in our society on a larger scale.
Yes. And can I ask you, are you looking to really integrate that in moving forward with your own teaching and practice?
Well, the one thing that I was going to mention at the very end was that for all the fact that I have had a working relationship with people like Jade, and we made sure that we incorporated Indigenous academic voices like Marcia Langton into our subject. The real failing, and I was going to say the failing of the subject was still that there was no direct Indigenous consultation. So, like I said, the subject had to be put together incredibly fast. COVID really disrupted the way we thought we were going to continue to evolve the course. So there is still major room for improvement. And my key concern is that we need to get some direct Indigenous perspectives on how the subject currently is. So yeah, it's by no means a perfect subject at all.
It's great to be discussing it and to have you present and for people.
Absolutely, it's the beginning. It's the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone who asked questions, and thanks again to Vincent. That was excellent. And now we can move across to John Wilkins, who is a philosopher of biology. He completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne, but now floats between universities teaching, and is very famous for his work on species, at least in my field. And today he has been speaking on the philosopher's universal topic, what makes a phenomenon significant? Tongue twister.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Yep, okay, good. All right, now, as Gemma kindly noted, I work, among other things, on species concepts. And in the course of revising my big species book, for those of you who are Darwin scholars, you recognise the reference, I put in an argument against the idea that species are a theoretical construct in science, and that they are instead phenomena which are recognised and, as phenomena are wont to be, in need of explanation. Now, that set me down a rabbit hole, and I'm here to emerge with the dirt on my head. So what counts as a phenomenon in science has not been well discussed. In fact, there's almost nothing in the literature. Now, this astonishes the hell out of me, because I would have expected that something so crucial to the development of empirical science back in the 18th and 17th centuries was somehow explicated in greater detail. The role of phenomena has been well discussed. There's no doubt about that. It was discussed, as I'll get onto in a minute, by Newton, among others. But since Bogan and Woodward published a paper in 1988 called Saving the Phenomena, which is a riff on a phrase that was used in the Middle Ages astronomical debates, the idea wasn't that you had a theory of the way the universe was, but that you had a way of calculating planetary positions and so forth that saved the phenomena. Now, Bogan and Woodward made a number of claims, but the most important one is that there's a distinction between data and phenomena. They used the example of the melting point of lead. We do not record the melting point of lead in experiments. We might run a bunch of experiments or a bunch of tests and get a scatter of data, right? And we regress to the mean, we control for variables and so forth. And the end result is that the phenomenon of the melting point of lead is a certain temperature in degrees Kelvin. Now, an early response to this distinction between data and phenomenon was made by James McAllister. McAllister wrote very early on in 89 that in any given data set, any given data set can be described as the sum of any one of infinitely many distinct patterns with a corresponding incidence of noise. In other words, you have a function and a degree of noise which or slop in the measurements which allows that function to be interpreted. Now, if there's an infinite number of functions for a data set, that raises a serious problem, and the issue it raises for me is what makes a pattern in data a phenomenon. If there's an infinite number of patterns, there's certainly not an infinite number of phenomena, right? In a large data set. So what is it that makes a particular pattern or set of foils, patterns in the literature, phenomena? And there's no answer to that so far that I've been able to come up with. And this astonishes me. People such as Ian Hacking, Bas van Fraassen and so forth, they've talked about phenomena, but they've not given an understanding, clear or otherwise, of what makes something a phenomenon. So what I want to do is to go through this problem, offer a suggestion, and then see how that would apply to my special subject species as phenomena. Now, after McAllister's paper, Bruce Glymore noted that this argument of his basically made phenomena subjective, which, as you all know, is a very bad word in science, right? You can't be subjective in science. So if you are prepared to tolerate 100% data, then anything is a phenomenon and you can choose what you like. If you're only prepared to tolerate zero data, then maybe you don't get phenomena, maybe you don't get patterns at all, you just get the dot plots or something like that. Okay, so let's take it up with Newton, as we always should. He wrote, and this is where I got my title, he wrote to the Royal Society, probably to Oldenburg, what I shall tell them, tell the society concerning colours is not a hypothesis, but most rigid consequence, not conjectured by barely inferring 'tis thus because not otherwise, or because it satisfies all phenomena, Philosopher's universal topic, but evinced by the mediation of experiments concluding directly and without any suspicion of a doubt. That is such a naive view that I cannot believe Newton held it. Okay, even in his day, that was a naive view. These days, it's something that is, it's not even on the starting blocks. So his naive view was that they were direct inferences from the data, but the list of phenomena he gives in the Principia and his subsequent discussion in colours and so forth suggests quite the opposite. They are technical problems in a discipline, such as the ratios of orbits, which are calculated and not observed. So in effect, the Bogan-Woodward view is supported by this. Kirsten Walsh, who put me onto the Newtonian phenomena, suggests that Newton used the term to avoid saying hypothesis, because, of course, famously he wrote hypothesis non fingo, I do not make or frame hypotheses. In any event, she also notes that at the time, a phenomenon was regarded as a remarkable or extraordinary appearance, which means, of course, that if you take it at face value, it is in fact a subjectivist position. So we've got some problems here for empiricism and theory realism and so forth. Now, I mentioned Ian Hacking before. Hacking is my go-to guy. Whenever I'm not sure about a topic, I go and read him. This is from his famous Representing and Intervening. And I'll just quickly read it. A phenomenon is noteworthy. A phenomenon is discernible. These are both subjective characters. A phenomenon is commonly an event of a certain type that occurs regularly under certain circumstances. The word certain is doing a fair bit of hard work there. The word can also denote a unique event that we single out as particularly important. When we know the regularity exhibited in a phenomenon, we express it in a law-like generalization. The very fact of such a regularity is sometimes called the phenomenon. So what has he given us there to identify the difference between any pattern that you've arbitrarily chosen and the objective phenomenon in the real world? The answer is not a thing. He hasn't suggested any way to evade constructivism or subjectivism. So let's take a step back, have a look at Bogan and Woodward's view a little bit. Now, in their original papers, Bogan and Woodward did not define what they thought a phenomenon was. But Woodward did in a paper in 2000, so that's 12 years later. According to him, phenomena are stable, repeatable effects or processes that are potential objects of prediction and systematic explanation by general theories, and which can serve as evidence for such theories. So we've got three criteria. 1, stability and repeatability. 2, they're potential objects of prediction and explanation. And 3, by theories that are supported by the phenomena, which is somewhat circular, but not at all ahistorical. That's pretty much how people have used it. So my question is, what makes something a phenomenon? All these characterizations of phenomena tell us what the authors think is necessary for something to be a phenomenon, and thus play a role in explanation and theory support. However, none of them tell us which appearances qualify as phenomena. Hacking says only of a certain type. Woodward says potential objects of prediction and systematic explanation, which leaves us no wiser which appearances are, before the pattern is explained, potentially explicable. As far as I can find, not ever dealt with, and is treated as something in the scientific disciplines which everybody knows, not unlike species in biology. So since I'm arguing this to support my claim that species are just phenomena in need of explanation, there's a bit of an irony in my making this parallel. So to summarize to this point, there are an indefinitely and possibly infinitely large number of patterns in large data sets with noise, and in consonance with the underdetermination principle, there's really no way to reduce that down to a tractable number, at least not programmatically. Very few of these patterns are selected as phenomena. So I'm going to propose that a phenomenon is something of interest in a discipline at a time in a theoretical or research context that suits one or more investigators. What could be more subjectivist or constructivist than that? Okay, I'm going to use a simple example, although the more I looked into it, the less simple it appeared to be. Gas laws. Now, we've all heard of the ideal gas law. I should very carefully explain that I've never studied physics, I've never studied chemistry, I've never studied the maths necessary to do this, and so I will get something wrong, but I've tried to go to good sources. So let's have a look. Here we see deviations of the ideal gas laws. There are three main gas laws: Boyle's law, Charles' law, and Gay-Lussac's law. On the left is Boyle's law, volume to pressure. On the right is Gay-Lussac's law on the relationship between pressure and temperature. And the solid lines show you what the ideal gas laws offer you. Now, the ideal gas law is something that happens in what's called kinetic gas theory. And the idea here is, as a simplification, all particles of a gas, all corpuscles or atoms or whatever, are regarded as points that are inelastic, occupy no space, but nevertheless bang off each other, bounce off each other in a kinetic fashion. But when you start putting real gases into it, you notice that there are some deviations. And the obvious reason is, well, I'll get to that in a second, but what I want to point out is that the deviations from these laws call for explanation. They pose a problem, or in Kuhnian terms, an anomaly. I used to think anomaly, by the way, meant something that was not covered by a law. It doesn't. It just means something that stands out, something that is salient, I guess you'd say. So let's have a look at the full laws. On the left here, we've got Boyle's, Charles, Gayler's, Lusak's, and Avogadro's laws, which is to do with the number of particles that are in a system. And you can see it forms a very nice shape with isotherms and isobars and relationships between volume and temperature and so forth. And it looks fine, doesn't it? I mean, obviously that's not the entire space for an ideal gas law. It extends indefinitely in at least two other dimensions. But when you actually look at a particular gas, you get something far more like the one on the right, where you have different phases, you have sudden transitions from liquid vapor to gas, or liquid vapor to vapor, or liquid vapor to liquid. There's a triple line where it can become liquid vapor or a solid, and it's very, very messy. And it depends upon the atomic weight, it depends upon the number of particles and so forth. And that's because particles in real gases occupy space. What's more, they don't occupy space as hard inelastic particles, but as probability distributions of electrons, of particular size nuclei, and it has to include weak attraction forces or van der Waals forces. But that's to look at it after the fact. That's the way van der Waals amended the gas laws to deal with these these anomalous cases. Hang on, my mouse has disappeared. Where am I? There we go. Right. Okay, so the discovery that van der Waals was responding to, there we go. The story that van der Waals was responding to was the discovery by Thomas Andrews at Queen's University in Dublin in 1869 and reviewed by James Clerk Maxwell. It was actually his PhD thesis, that the kinetic theory of gases failed in cases of high pressure, of high temperature, of very low pressure or low volume. And van der Waals came up with his idea of weak attraction forces. We don't even pay it attention these days. So this raises for me a question. If you think of a model or a theory as a function in a state space, which is the standard way that physicists seem to approach these things, right? An anomaly is something which the behavior of the system does not track the surface of the function, okay? The coordinate that identifies the space, the actual gas cylinder that you're looking at, how it's going to behave, does not follow that surface of the ideal gas law. It deviates from it in ways that are significant. But the problem there is that if an anomaly is defined as a repeatable deviation from the surface of some received model of the system in a state space, how much deviation? We're back to McAllister's problem. Noise is ubiquitous in measurement. So when does it cease to be noise, even repeatable noise? And when does it start to become a deviation, a signal of some kind? Now, statistical approaches seek to minimize but cannot eliminate noise. So what we've got to ask is, what's the gold standard? Is there a gold standard? And the thing that I've found is that there's a different standard in every discipline. Like p-values, the threshold is arbitrary on a continuous scale, for what information theory calls the surprisal value. How surprising is it that this is what you're going to observe, given what you know? It's sort of a Bayesian surprise. And this is what made Glymour declare that McAllister's argument implied phenomena are subjective. But I think what we've got is an intersubjective rather than a domain relative, or rather a domain relative set of criteria. In other words, it's the disciplinary something, right? It's intersubjective or relative to the discipline, and it's honed by experience. So any domain or discipline that is working on gases in this case, or species in other cases, they have a wealth of practical and implicit information about their domain. In fact, that's how they defined a domain in the first place. How am I going for time, Gemma?
1 minute to 20 minutes in.
Okay, we'll go very quickly then. So this is what I'm proposing. Something becomes a phenomenon when it's repeatable. It's not just measurement error. This is something that mathematicians and statisticians give us. It's a continuous problem. It's not just something that's noticed once, recorded, and then moved on from. Apoptosis is in development. This is the program cell death. Was rediscovered 7 times from 1842 to 1972, and only in 1972 did it become an anomaly. It's got to be tractable, and this is why it became an anomaly in 1972. It's got to be addressable by the current or novel instrumentation and protocols, and it's got to be capable of being explained with the right theory, the right extensions or variations to the model. Right? But most of all, it's got to be seen in the practical judgment of investigators that there's a payoff. Now, the payoff can be a payoff in terms of their career, or it can be a cognitive or a theoretical payoff, right? Or it can just be a payoff of being something that you can solve that others haven't before the others do. But I think a phenomenon is fundamentally a disciplinary phenomenon. Okay. Once something has become a phenomenon and has been explained, it remains a phenomenon. Or very often, not always. So this is largely because traditional narratives are repeated in the faux histories at the front of textbooks taught to students. And so the students are told that the precession of Mercury, for example, one of Newton's problems, is a phenomenon. But precession is observed in all orbiting rotating planets. So why is the Mercury one such a phenomenon? And the answer is largely because Newton addressed it as a problem that he could solve. And Einstein later refined that. So that's one reason. It's used to exclude deviant data in the traditions. The other two are there's an incomplete explanation. That is, we've got what in the 19th century they would have called a kinetic model, that is a description of the behavior of the system, but not a causal model, of what physicists called a dynamic model in the 19th century. And finally, there's a wider cultural use. So if I can steal a few more seconds, I'd just like to say how this works out with species. I've said 30 flavors of ice cream. There's somewhere between my count of 28 or 9 and Frank Zarkos, mate of mine, his count of 32 species concepts. And of course, more are being published every few years. But every naturalist, as Darwin noticed, knows roughly what they mean by the term. So I've got a chapter in a forthcoming volume. The volume is called Species, Problems and Beyond, called The Good Species, where I point out that most scientists learn how to use species as a concept, not from definitions or explicit teaching, but by observing how other people apply it in their discipline. So the species are not necessarily explained, but if you know a group, you know what's a species in that group. And you may think that you're applying one theoretical definition, such as the biological species concept, but then you discover there are species in your group that are asexual. What do? You revert to some other justification of what it is you do in any event. So they qualify as species. Okay, so that's what I am working on at the moment, and I look forward to questions and criticisms.
Thanks so much, John. Do you want to stop the screen share and then we can go into
yes, sorry.
questions? No, totally fine. Just where it says share.
Sorry. Yeah, it moves around on my screen, so I have to
right.
for it.
No worries. I might take the liberty of making the first comments or question. I think you're spot on that phenomena is not, it's just a very slippery term, and that it's very domain specific, because in my session I'm giving a talk on psychiatric phenomena, and the idea of a psychiatric phenomena is just, it's fuzzy, so fuzzy to the point that, you know, you can just reject them as completely if you want to. But I did think of things like, but even the criteria that you laid out, like I did think of things like rare diseases in medicine, like Alice in Wonderland syndrome or something like that. Very, very rare, very internal. It relies on subjective experience, like accounts of subjective experience of feeling very big or feeling very small in relation to your environment. We have no idea why it happens. Obviously something to do with the vestibular system, but that's about it. And yet we still count that as a disease and therefore a phenomena, right? But it's not really repeatable. It's not really understood. It's incredibly fuzzy. And I just wonder if, because I come from psych, the sciences, and you come from biology, we're okay with that. But are the physicists okay with that?
Well, I used to naively believe at one point that physics was the exact science. I've been disabused of this by a number of physicists of my acquaintance. The classification of particles is called the particle zoo, and that's not an accident. It's like we've got all these things, we try to put them together, we've got a standard model, it doesn't account for this. What the heck is all that stuff over there? And yes, there's slop, even in the so-called exact sciences. I think, however, with psychiatry, and I'm strongly influenced by Dom Murphy's book, Psychiatry and the Scientific Image, I think a lot of this is a phenomenon is something in psychiatry which is basically addressable. Now, I won't say treatable, because there's arguments about that. I think a lot of these phenomena or diseases are classified in terms of there being a drug that does something, and there's something here that contradicts cultural norms, and so we'll approach it that way. The DSM, I think, is probably one of the more flawed documents in science. And also it has a very strong Jungian background. It was initially, according to Dom, initially set up along Jungian categories. And of course, that's all gone. So, no, I don't know. I suspect that the world is such that even in the most exact sciences, where we are measuring physical constants down to 15 decimal places and so forth, the world is complex enough that no matter how exact you get, you are going to classify what you might think of as meso level, middle level phenomena, not the really quantum nano level, but the stuff you and I bump into when we've got our eyes closed. I suspect that physicists are just as vague and base things on practice the way that we humanities people and biology people and so forth do.
Yeah, perhaps we're just more willing to accept it or be open about it.
I think we have less defense against it.
It's true. It's true. And as a student of Dominic's, yeah, I subscribe to that view as well. But I would say that I don't always see mental illness as negative categories. Like they don't have to have a harm component, but many people do think that they have to have a harm component and they have to have a treatment.
Yeah, that's a debate I really haven't gotten into. What do they call classification in diseases? There's a term for it. It's not taxonomy, or there is a term, the nosology.
Nosology, yeah.
So nosology of diseases. It strikes me that we're probably at the almost magic level of identifying diseases in psychiatry. Mind you, we're not that much better with a lot of physical diseases as well as neurological and psychological and cultural.
Yeah.
There's a lot of disentangling here that needs to go on, and I'm really looking to forward to hearing from Gay Fang what he is going to tell us about cultural evolution. So, because I think ultimately all of this is cultural evolution. It's Nietzschean genealogies.
We have time for another question. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Thank you, John, for this very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, a lot of examples you have raised here are examples coming from mature science. And cultural evolution is not a mature science. There are so many schools trying to fight for who got the foundation right. And it feels like different schools will have their different anomaly. And if some schools' phenomenal anomaly cannot be fruitful for future research, then I think maybe in the future they won't be mentioned in the textbook. So do you think that this is not?
Textbooks are inherently conservative. They inherently maintain some mythological narrative to justify what they're doing. Now, I say this as somebody who once upon a time, I got better, used to hold the mimetic view of cultural evolution. But in line with what Vincent was talking about with the historical materialist view, a view I have since adapted in my own way, it seems to me that phenomena are an interplay between the conceptual ideological world on the one hand and the material conditions in which those things arise. And there's no single causal pathway. So I think cultural evolution is one of those things that, as Kim Storelny once said, it's got to be right in some sense. We just don't know yet what it is. And because of all the emphasis on genes and there being something like particulate cultural items that evolved in the late 80s, early 90s, cultural evolution has been shunted off into a seriously problematic area. And I'm starting to see stuff done by, what's the guy in New Zealand? He's done a lot of work on canoe art in the Pacific.
Godfrey Smith?
Sorry?
Is it Godfrey? Peter Godfrey Smith?
Oh, no, Godfrey Smith worked with him, but no, there's an anthropologist, I think at Christchurch. I can't remember his name just off the top of my head, but there's a lot of work being done on non-discrete, non-symbolic cultural evolution. And I really see what I'm talking about as fitting into that. These are styles, these are tropes, these are prototypes. Okay, so there's a lot of work being done in biology at the moment on what counts as the edge of a species. How do you delimit between species? And I once remarked in a scientific conference, look, you can identify the mode. Why do you need the delimitations? You know there's a mountain peak there. Why do you need to know when that mountain peak and that mountain peak meet? You don't. You just need the concept of a sparse distribution or something of that kind. But no, people keep talking about what defines a species. And I think I actually got into species because of cultural evolution. I wanted to know what it was that evolved in culture. Okay, so it's a directly analogous problem.
Nice. We might use that as a segue, I think.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you, John. That was very interesting, and I look forward to reading your book, actually, your work. Okay, is it Gay? Is that how you say?
G.
G is
fine.
G? Make my name G.
G. Sorry.
Okay. G Fang is up next. He's going to talk on cultural evolution with a talk called A Focus on Persistence for Cultural Evolution. He's a graduate student from the Philosophy and Neuroscience Psychology program at Washington University in St. Louis and works at the Illinois
cool.
Institute of Technology as a pre-doctoral teaching fellow. So I'm very happy to have you here. And if you want to share your screen, you can take it away. I'll ring a bell at 10 minutes.
All right. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Gemma, for your kind introduction. And the title of my talk today is A Focus on Persistence for Cultural Evolution. This project comes out of my dissertation project, which is about the explanation of the conservatism behind Acheulean hand axe tradition. So the kind of culture I'm most interested in is very old in our evolutionary past, about maybe 1.7 million years ago. I'm also interested in cultural evolution of more recent times, but they mostly serve as a contrast class for studying the cultural evolution of our distant past. I'm aware that there is a huge controversy surrounding the foundational ideas of cultural evolution, especially regarding how we construe the notion of culture and how we construe the notion of evolution. I'm not going to address the legitimacy of the field of cultural evolution in this talk, but several remarks about how these notions are used in my talk would be helpful. My argument adopts a pre-theoretical notion of culture, or at least a pluralistic concept of culture. Cultures can be ideas, habits, even domestic species or artifacts, like canoes. And culture must directly or indirectly depend on social transmission. A long-term change or lack of change, or a certain culture across many cultural generations of inheritance. I'm not presupposing that cultural evolution is a Darwinian cultural evolutionary process, or that cultural evolution must involve long-term change. For example, the tradition of Acheulean hand axe making, which has lasted for over 1 million years without significant change, is a key explanation in my project. The main goal of today's talk is to consider whether a focus on the differences in types of cultural persistence can be epistemically important in the study of cultural evolution. By cultural persistence, I mean the continued existence of an individual's cultural trait within a single cultural generation. For example, if I present my idea to you today and 10 days later, you tell it to someone else, the process that the idea persisted in your memory during the 10-day period is a process of cultural persistence. As the diagram below indicates, as time passes on, processes of cultural persistence alternate with processes of cultural inheritance. The notion of cultural persistence should be distinguished from the notion of cultural stability, which describes the continued existence of a shared cultural trait across multiple cultural generations. This notion has been very important in the discussion, and in this talk, I don't mean to advertise for the importance of cultural stability or try to come up with an explanation for it. And cultural persistence should also be distinguished from cultural fitness, which describes the degree in which a cultural trait helps its carrier to survive. these two notions come apart because a culture can be very, very persistent while still reducing the fitness of the carrier, such as Buddhism. Now, the question of whether a culture persists or not is not a very interesting question, because for something to be called a culture, it must have some mechanism to ensure its persistence. But there is an interesting question about how much the modes of cultural persistence contribute to or undermine a culture's persistence, inheritance, and evolution. By modes of cultural persistence, I mean the vehicles underlying the storage and development of culture. Some cultures persist because of their durable modes of persistence, and other cultures persist despite their ephemeral modes of persistence. As we will see soon, the current cultural evolutionary research abstracts away varieties of cultural persistence. The question I'm interested in is whether this lack of attention to modes of cultural persistence is epistemically justifiable. My answer is no. I think cultural evolutionary studies should put more epistemic focus on cultural persistence. Now, here is the plan of my talk today. First, I will describe the current research and vindicate my statement that current research has indeed abstracted away persistence. Then I will propose two quantitative measures that will capture the influence of modes of persistence on cultural inheritance and cultural evolution. One is durability and the other is malleability. And finally, I will spell out some implications for cultural evolutionary research. The first type of current research I want to mention is microsociety studies in psychological laboratories. In these studies, subjects are recruited to form microsocieties that go through multiple cultural generations, trying to maintain skills for a certain task, such as folding a paper aeroplane that can fly as far as possible. Every iteration is simulated by removing some old members and adding new ones. As we can see from the table that summarizes the procedure for this paradigm that comes from Cadwell and Mitchum's 2008 paper, during the simulation, each learning episode is immediately followed by the next. There is no persistence period at all. Similar lack of attention to cultural persistence can be seen in comparative studies. Researchers in this field is usually interested in social learning capacities, causal reasoning capacities, and communicative capacities, all of which have been hypothesized to be factors contributing to effective cultural inheritance. A lot of recent debates in cultural evolutionary studies is how important these factors are in supporting distinctively human cultural capacities. I don't have a dog in this fight. I only want to note that none of these factors can be intuitively connected to variations in modes of persistence. Another popular approach is to construct formal models for cultural evolution. These studies focus on how individual social learning strategies bias cultural inheritance and how individual biases aggregate to determine long-term cultural dynamics at the population level. All the formal models can be read as abstracting away modes of cultural persistence. At one place in Boyd and Richardson's classical 1985 book, they entertained the thought that a change of cultural trait within an individual through the passage of time can be modeled as just a special kind of cultural inheritance. I have no problem with calling cultural persistence a special kind of cultural inheritance, as long as we put more empirical focus on studying how such special cultural inheritance works. As far as I know, formal models have not yet motivated any research on the varieties of cultural dynamics within a single cultural generation. Last but not the least, we have human evolutionary narratives. Most of these narratives emphasize the evolution of our enhanced capacities for cultural inheritance and how such capacities causally interact with cooperation, niche construction, life history, etc. The evolution of dominant modes of cultural persistence had not been described in existing narratives. Now that I have given a brief overview about how the current cultural evolutionary studies have largely overlooked the modes of cultural persistence, let's move on to look at how adding this focus can make a significant contribution to our understanding of how cultures transmit and evolve. Consider the following two kinds of culture, a joke and a piano skill. There are many differences in how these two cultures are inherited and how they evolve. A joke takes very, very little effort to learn. Just by listening to the joke and rehearsing it in your mind, you have already inherited the joke. But to inherit a piano skill, it takes much more effort. We need to practice a motor sequence repetitively over a really, really long time. The former probably takes 10 minutes, whereas the latter can take as long as 10 years. Because of such differences, jokes often transmit from peer to peer, whereas a piano skill is usually inherited across biological generations. For a joke, it needs to gain a lot of popularity in order to remain stable, whereas for a piano skill, it can be inherited stably in a linear manner within a very limited pool of pianists. Joke can be modified easily. If we learn the joke, we can change it to suit different needs according to our social context. Piano skills cannot be modified as easily. It is hard to change the style of playing piano. It is also hard to change bad habits in playing. Changing the piano skill again requires repetitive and conscious practice over a long time. Because it takes so much shorter time to inherit and so much fewer iterations, a joke usually is transmitted with low fidelity by default. It is very likely for anyone to misremember parts of the joke, but for a piano skill, because it requires very long time and repetitive practice, you can inherit it with high fidelity by default. When a joke becomes popular and stable, the duration is usually much shorter than a single biological generation, the duration of stability, I mean. But for skill, a stable cultural lineage can cross many biological generations. Here are two diagrams to illustrate the differences in the transmission and evolution of patterns between a joke and a piano skill. Note that these are minimal models that do not always reflect reality. The diffusion network of a joke is usually not a linear chain, but can involve much broadcasting and repetitive learning. A piano student, similarly, can also take lessons from multiple teachers, and jokes can be learned from earlier generations. Piano skills can be learned from peers. Still, these diagrams suggest the minimal requirement for cultural inheritance and evolution, and they also depict common motifs in actual evolutionary patterns. These differences in transmission and evolutionary pattern, in my opinion, can be explained by the differences in the malleability and durability of modes of persistence. By malleability, I mean how difficult it is to modify stored cultural content. Content stored in more malleable modes of persistence can be changed with less effort and less time. Durability of a mode of persistence measures how long the cultural content can remain faithful without much conscious interventions. A joke transmits and evolves in that way because it is stored in the modes of ideas, which has low durability and high malleability. Piano skills transmits and evolves in that way because it is stored in the modes of mature skills, which has high durability and low malleability. Now, two additional remarks about the category of mature skills. First, not every know-how belongs to this category. For example, the know-how you can learn in 2 minutes in a micro-society paradigm regarding how to fold a paper plane is probably memorized as an ordered set of instructions, which more properly belongs to the category of idea. Second, mature skill is also not limited to motor skills. We can train ourselves to be very good at doing arithmetic calculations in our mind, and the training is as repetitive as training a piano skill. The connection between fidelity and repetition is a key point, but the idea is not old at all. It has been discussed extensively by Stroni as well as by Mohan. However, both authors haven't made any explicit connections between repetitions and modes of persistence. One possible reason for not doing so is that increasing quantities of transmission episodes can also stabilize the evolution of a joke. So one might think that what is really doing the explanatory work here is quantity of transmission, but not modes of persistence. But I think the quantity involved in skill learning and the quantity involved in joke popularization differ in three important aspects. First, quantity is necessary for skill inheritance, but not for joke inheritance. The mere existence of skill is already evidence for the quantity in learning. And this is important for inference about inheritance fidelity in our distant evolutionary history. And second, repetitive social learning for skill inheritance is concentrated on one individual, while the quantity of joke learning is usually due to a wide distribution of the joke. Third, fidelity of skill learning involves so much more than just quantity. The skill can be learned more effectively by more concentration during practice, better methods of practice, better temporal spacing of repetitions, and even better rest. Instead of classifying modes of persistence into qualitatively different kinds, I think we should assign degrees of durability and malleability to different modes of persistence. These two dimensions can be applied to many different modes of cultural persistence. It applies to culture stored not only in our mind, but also outside of our mind. Different external objects, depending on their material, can have different malleability and durability. For most time in human evolutionary history, malleability is reversely proportional to durability, because the only way to store something for a long time is to make the medium of storage highly inert to external influences. But we shouldn't equate the concept of durability to the concept of lack of malleability, as the invention of drawing and writing has shown that it is possible to be both durable and malleable. I think it is also theoretically possible for some medium to have low durability and low malleability. For example, a system can be spontaneously changing at a rapid pace while being very inert to external forces, but such a system would be impractical for carrying cultural content. More generally speaking, less malleable modes are associated with longer periods and more repetitive copying attempts in each cultural inheritance. And culture stored in more durable modes are more likely to interact with biological evolution. A very, very rough trend of available modes of persistence in human evolutionary history can be described as moving from the diagonal of the 2D space to the top right corner of the 2D space. Now, if we only look at the high durability modes, which are also the modes that are more likely to create an impact on our biological evolution, then in the Pleistocene, most enduring cultural capitals of our ancestors persisted as mature skills, which have low malleability. Today, a significant portion of our enduring cultural capitals persisted as external symbols, which have high malleability. Now, let us move on to discuss the potential implications of my framework on existing cultural evolutionary research. The first point to note is that we should remain epistemically vigilant toward inferences across modes of drastically different degrees of malleability and durability. This would mean that we should not infer from today's or simulated cultural evolution to ancestral cultural evolution, or to infer from social learning capacity of ideas to social learning capacity of skills. This leads to the second point, which is that we should be extra careful in using the notion of social learning. On the one hand, it describes the episode where one copies another's behavior through social learning mechanisms. On the other hand, social learning is the inheritance of a trait from others. The latter can involve multiple instances of the former. More importantly, the property of the two notions are not interchangeable. I suspect that some notions, such as social learning strategy, can only apply to the first type of social learning, but not to the second type of social learning. Finally, I think an awareness of varying modes of persistence can shift our focus from explaining the possibility of cultural stability to explaining the possibility of cultural change. The reason why we have been so obsessed with explaining cultural stability is because we implicitly assume that early cultures, like today's cultures, have high malleability and low durability. With this assumption, stability of culture is our first achievement in evolutionary history. But I think stability is a given, and if we assume that early cultures have low malleability and high durability, or if I'm allowed to use John's term in his earlier talk, stability is not a phenomenal anomaly here. What is more puzzling is not how such cultures can remain stable, but rather how such cultures can start to change in the late Pleistocene. The instability of skilled culture in the late Pleistocene is the phenomenal anomaly. This is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. If you want to stop the screen share, then we can. Yeah. Thanks. Interesting to see that you're working with Ron Mellon. John, do you have a question?
Of course. First of all, the person I was thinking of was Russell Gray. So canoe decorations and so forth in the Pacific. Do you think that as persistence increases in the durability of symbolic representations of practices, that in practical space changes? You know, for instance, can it flatten out, or does it increase? What happens there?
Can you explain the question? I'm not sure I follow.
Yes, I would if I could talk. So you had an impractical region in your graph of durability and malleability for cultural inheritance. At least that's how I read it. Do you think that those values change over prehistorical and historical times? And does it mean that we have a greater access to the space that is practicable for culture, or less space? Are we losing the sort of feasibility space for culture as we get less durable and more durable and less malleable?
I think if we start to rely more and more on external symbol storage, we will lose more and more of our earlier skill storage, and we will become, as the society shapes us into just relying on always interpreting the symbols, we have less and less of a chance to practice our skills. So in that sense, yes, skills inheritance will become more difficult in the current society, if that is what you're asking. But I don't think the possibility space shrink. First, it is not a space for inheritance per se, but really a space for modes of persistence. And modes of persistence describes the periods in between different kinds of inheritance. But I guess you can say that because the society is such a way that we don't have enough time to practice the inheritance of the modes at the right bottom corner of that space. then indeed we have shrink the utility of that corner.
Right. So it's culturally relative, in other words.
Yes. Yes. Also, I
Okay.
think another aspect of cultural relativity is that some culture, some material might at first sit in the middle of the graph. For example, the stone culture, it might at first be very, very hard to manipulate, very, very hard to carve, because we don't we don't have the proper tool to shape stones.
Yeah.
We only have those very primitive technologies for hitting stones and shaping them. But as technology develops, sometimes we will have better technology to shape stones so that that material can also move in that space.
Yeah. May I ask one more question, or am I interrupting somebody else? Okay, so it seems to me that one of the big changes in the sort of late Pleistocene onwards, it's obviously the agricultural revolution, but in particular, it's the size of populations that are available both as carriers, but also as differentiating cultures. So you have multiple subcultures. Largely, you know, when they're still living in traditional societies, you're not much bigger than you were in the early to mid Pleistocene, but you have influences and information and artifacts coming into your village or township or whatever. So I suspect that a lot of the changes, and I can't really visualize how this would work, I can't really sort of calculate what those changes would be, but it seems to me a lot of changes will be to do with the sort of fractionating of cultural societies. So the more people you have, the more subcultures you can support, which means that only a small number of people are keeping the traditions going. But a lot of people are having casual interactions with those traditions and maybe picking up some things.
Yeah.
So that was a comment, not a question.
Yes, I think I don't think this is directly related to this project, but this is very relevant to the other chapter of my dissertation, which is the development of this chapter. And I think that because we don't have a lot of time for learning skill, so our storage for skill is actually limited. So in order for one society to have a lot of different skills, it's actually improbable that we just increase our skill learning capacity. It's not like we can increase our lifespan so that we can learn 10 instruments in one lifespan. So there has to be some division of labor. And this kind of necessity of division of labor kind of make the population size a very important factor in determining the numerosity of technological expertise in later hominin evolution and the human evolution. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks both. Do we have any other questions or comments? I just had one thought, and I don't know if you have a response to it. It's definitely not a question, it's a thought, a comment. That this makes sense to me that cultural persistence is important, and that stability comes out of that, not as a kind of amazing, life-changing, history-making thing, but that it's just a function of cultural persistence. And that makes me think of Vincent's talk, actually, that all the items in the 100 things, right, they have some kind of cultural persistence. That's why we care about them. We don't really care about things that are very transient or what have you. I mean, we do, but not in the same way. They don't end up on those lists of 100 things. Mm.
Oh no, I thought the talk was fascinating as well, because straight away when you talked about the persistence of ideas, straight away I thought about the Indigenous concept of songlines, where you would have this incredibly complex cultural knowledge that would be taught from one generation to the next. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that over a very long period of time, there's very minimal change. Now, on one hand, that had to do with just the stability of the climate. Once we make it to the last 10,000 years and everything sort of settles down, it makes it easier that information you're learning is very, relevant to navigating your landscape. But yeah, I mean, it's an incredible idea that there is this complex knowledge that takes a lot of time and energy to learn. But you do indeed, it's imperative that it's stored up there. And in contrast, I mean, the other word that came to my mind when you talked about, G, about the today, you often hear the word grazing, that today students particularly are expected to graze. They're meant in relation to the information they use. They're being taught how to graze. And I'm ashamed to say that probably the 100 objects is probably quite a good example of that they're meant to take on board a lot of information, and they have to sort of learn how to choose which bits are relevant, and of course that comes down to the fact that we do have writing, that we are able to communicate ideas across millennia, really, in written form, and you're not dependent upon being directly taught by someone who has all that knowledge stored up here. Sorry, I don't know, I'm probably rambling now. I thought it was very interesting what you were talking about.
Thank you. Yes, I think you have made some very important point. So I have assumed in my talk that different modes don't interact with each other, but actually they do, and they do a lot. And probably because of our later evolution made them interact so much that we have been able to change our culture rapidly. And for example, if you are learning a skill from some other people, just as what you said, we don't directly imitate some other people. We sometimes will keep a set of instruction in our mind and start practicing that instruction. And this kind of intermediate layer of cultural storage that is between the earlier generation of skill and this generation of skill storage, this intermediate layer makes it possible that we can make innovations about how we do something. For example, if you observed how your teacher play piano and you make some notes about how your teacher plays piano, and then you misunderstand that note, but you have made some good error in that misunderstanding, so that your playing might be better than your teacher. I think that is a very powerful mechanism for us to make changes in our skill repertoire.
Well, I think the idea of short-term, the idea of grazing again. We're living in a world where obviously some things remain the same, but when it comes to technology and the way we interact with each other, I mean, the fact that we're interacting in a way that 20 years ago was, still a very new thing. The world isn't stable anymore. The way we interact, the technology, it's so rapidly developing. I can't keep up with all the updates to my laptop and all my different passwords. Like, it drives me crazy. So it's sort of logical that the way to navigate this rapidly unstable changing system is that you will develop very different skills to people 10,000 years ago, where changes were, incredibly slow, even at the dawn of the agricultural revolution. I mean, generationally, it was, it wasn't like somebody suddenly came up with a tractor one day. It was an incredibly slow process, So
can I just
I'm rambling again. I'm not a scientist, so excuse me if I say naive or stupid things.
Can I just make one point? I don't think per capita that novelty is any greater now than it was in the Pleistocene. I think what's happened is twofold. One is we have much bigger populations, right? So there are more ideas popping up in a very large population than you would get in a small one. And the second is that we are able to transmit those with a fair degree of accuracy over a very wide, we're able to broadcast culture now. So it's not that the world is changing any quicker. If you just attend to what's going on in your neighborhood, you're not going to be swamped. You're swamped because you're trying to deal with information that's global, right? It's like the problem where people get very depressed about the world because they keep hearing all the bad news. Well, you're hearing bad news from Somalia, you're hearing bad news from Venezuela, you're hearing bad news from the entire world. And in fact, things are just pretty much as they've chugged along. I'm a great believer in cultural conservatism, and I think societies are scalar, and so if you have the equivalent scale, you're not dealing with anything more in the sense of change. The problem is, as you pointed out, that material conditions are also much broader now. They affect the way things are. What happens in China may end up causing supply chain problems for computers, and in 20 years we might not be able to buy computers the way we do now. So it's an interplay, but I really don't think that the rate of novelty has dramatically changed since the Pleistocene.
Yeah, I think it's the way we record those novelties that have dramatically changed. The way we are now able to just put those novelty into symbols and put them into some hard drive somewhere, and this message can just be broadcasted to everywhere in the world and be universally accessible. That's how the speed has just been ramped up for global scale innovations.
Interesting discussion. If you want to keep talking, you can. I might just take a little break because I'm going to the postgraduate session. But we can wrap it up formally here. And I just want to thank our speakers, G, Vincent, and John, for an excellent session. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your chairing.
No worries. Thanks.
And thank you to the audience as well.
Yes. The ones that are here and the ones that left and all that. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. See you in a future session.